welcome to everyone. So pleased that you're able to join us for this opportunity to share again with the artist Samuel Bak and dear friend and colleague, Dr. Carl Herbert, the icons of alone. It occurred to me when we use this title that we're actually going to try to be alone together, and using that particular optic on the most recent works of Sam Bak. Some months ago, I was visiting a studio with Chancellor Jeff Gold of the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And in that visit saw a collection of paintings, which we now call Icons of Alone, and was stunned, because I thought Sam was involved in preparing paintings for an exhibition which we have scheduled for April of 2023. These were a series of paintings in preparation for doing the larger paintings to augment the collection of 512 works which had been donated to the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And in looking at them, I said, is it possible that we could do a show just of these works? And that's what opened last Friday. And we are now about to share those images with you and a conversation about the notion of alone using the single image of the six-pointed star. So I think actually, welcome. We can now look at the first image and begin a conversation. This was an image that Sam has dealt with over at least 45 years. And I think that most of us who have some sense of history know has been part of history for at least 2,000 years. The notion of creating a single image is somewhat typical of the way Sam works. But in this case, the image is not a series of chess pieces or a variety of pairs. It is a single isolated image on a canvas. And the impact of walking into the gallery space today is considerably different than any of the other exhibitions of Sam's that we have done. So it is with great pleasure, actually, that we're able to share these works and to have them seen as a collection of alone or aloneness. And I'd ask Sam, if you want to begin and just share with us this image and how you have used it artistically, personally, historically, and emotionally.
Well, that, I will try to make it short, although the question that you asked me would have kept me a couple of days speaking about it. I was in New York in '74, and I met again then with Elie Wiesel. We developed a certain friendship, and he had this idea that we should maybe create an album of books on Jewish themes and so on. And I thought, well, that's really very interesting for me to try to work on some very basic symbols of the Jewish identity. And of course, I was then already overtaken by waves of memories and the days of, you know, when my Jewish identity kind of struck me in my face. And I remembered the arrival of the German army to Vilnius. I was 6, 7 years of age, and the way I was helping to cut out the yellow stars that we had to sew on our clothes and so on, and then I wore this yellow star on my coat until we were liberated by the Russians in '44. And I thought of you know how we felt in the ghetto, surrounded by these walls, with all the windows of where we lived were walled in with bricks, so that we would have no vision of the outside, and so on. The sense of aloneness, and also the sense of how the world was indifferent to whatever we felt it was going on there. And when I say we felt, I must say I was 8, 9 years of age. I did not have an idea of the Holocaust, of the enormity of the catastrophe that was going on. I didn't know anything about the Shoah or the Holocaust, of course. So these are things that I learned later. So later, when I learned all that, I must have also nourished some ancient memories in some way, because we know memory is not something, that we take out a photograph or we take out a folder and so on. We always recreate it. So memory is a recreation. So therefore, when I'm speaking of this feeling of alone, it is what I have learned and what has set in me in my perspective and view of those times. And maybe I should stop here and then give you many more
as we go along.
insights, yes, as we go along.
But Rusty, you come to this certainly with a very different life experience than Sam's or mine. And how do you respond to this image?
Well, it's, of course, Sam's first and foremost beautifully painted, and the perspective is so beautifully structured. But the concept of being alone and isolated is a very universal human one. I think one would never want to diminish the severity of what Sam or others in Vilnius or other war situations, like currently in the Ukraine, that's a pretty horrible, death-defying, if you're stay alive, event. But there's an aloneness. I come from this from medicine, for instance, and situations where you may have been given a life ending diagnosis of some sort. Suddenly you realize you are alone in the world, and the poignancy of sort of getting that feeling as you take a look at any of Sam's work, it resonates in many different ways. So it's, as I said, wonderfully constructed and something that resonates that feeling of isolation, and that isolation can come in many different forms.
Your reference to medicine reminds me very much of when someone is enduring the kind of diagnosis you just mentioned. But I think about it even in a small situation where someone has broken their arm. And you and I want to be responsive and sympathetic, but the person who is experiencing it fundamentally is still alone. It's their broken arm, it's their diagnosis that they're receiving. And to respect that in a certain sense, and to realize that that has been imposed on that single individual, and they are alone, no matter how loving, how supportive, how wonderful people can be. In history, it's become much more devastating for a group of people, whether it's Jews, Yazidi, whomever it is, to become alone. In that case, it is inflicted on them in such a way that there is no response other than to suffer it. So we're going to move on and look at one other of, I think, Sam's iconic images of the smoke, and both this and another larger painting of the star were intended as, or were the initial motivations for these paintings to take place, because the University of Nebraska has 512 works, but not large images either of smoke or of the alone. And Sam, if you would talk just a bit about this image of, sadly, transformation.
Well, let me answer here under two subtitles. One is the mere question of size. I think that the COVID woke up in me an awareness of this thing of size in art. I spent a lot of time during the COVID going into museums all over the world, looking at fantastic paintings, all this on the screen of my computer, where the paintings were very small or the paintings were very large. They all came to me more or less in the same size. And even a few days ago, I was in the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, and I looked at some tiny Dutch paintings, and I came very close to them, and I looked at them, and suddenly I forgot it's a painting of this, and they opened up into a large space. But yet, when I went back and looked at larger paintings, I was more taken up with them. And I thought about, I have small windows in my house. I have one big window in my house. There's a big window. I look at the sky, trees, the lawn, and so on. It's the small windows. I have to come very close to the window, look out, and so on. It's a different experience. So size suddenly became something of which I'm extremely aware. And I thought it was very important for the museum to have a few of the things that I'm doing in large size. Now, specifically, this painting, of course, is also a painting that I try to make the two chimneys that give out the smoke that turns into a kind of a cemetery. I did it before, and some paintings that I did about 30 or 40 years ago look much more like the two towers of New York that are burning, so I tried this painting to look less like the two towers of New York, but still, I mean, this smoke that billows out, thousands upon thousands, about hundreds of thousands of human beings that will be never buried, that are spread in the atmosphere, that we have absolutely no names, no identities, no memory of their existence. They all become tombstones, and tombstones that are quite specific. They all remind you somehow of the tablets of the law, which in some way are also a hint at the identity of the Jewish people.
Certainly, Sam, that transformation from chimneys to ashes to smoke to stone to tombstones, and relating it very much to the journey, if you will, of 6 million Jews over the course of the war, is both poignant and tragic. This image is part of a series you did, as you said, some, gosh, 35, 40 years ago, and then did a number of monumental pieces. One of these images of smoke is now hanging in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. And so the notion that you have created a visual vocabulary of whether it's the star, the smoke, the tablets, that really represents an entire era in human experience and human history, is really, really remarkable. I think it's important to move from this one somewhat to the next one, where talking about large and small. The other painting is 5 feet plus in scale, and this one is 14 inches high, but nonetheless does carry with it the clouds that have been transformed into some kind of stone. And I just would love for you to talk briefly about Study for a Cloud.
You are asking
You.
Yeah. Well, thinking again of the Jewish home, of I'm thinking here of the symbol of the rainbow, which is a symbol of divine promise that no more catastrophes will happen, and so on, has been completely turned upside down. So this Jewish home here, which is hanging on the brink of a little piece of landscape, which can fall into abyss at any moment, which has already pasted on it, if you look well, the symbol of the Star of David, and clouds that are destined to be stone. So the cloud is cut up here in a way in which it is floating between the amorphic form of a cloud and a very specific stone-like edge. And this is somehow the story of the existence of the Jewish people in Europe on the eve of the Second World War. It was everything hanging kind of on, on a precipice.
Sure. Rusty, do you want to talk a bit about this?
I think it's a wonderful image. It's a very personal one. I mean, there's so much of these paintings where you do feel dispossessed and alone, and you certainly do here, but you do it in a very personal way. This is like your home. This is your house. And you sort of identify it. And as Sam said, it's on a precipice. It could fall at any moment. You've sort of been rejected by God in a way because you've got you've got the rainbow upside down, and upside down flags mean danger. If you put the flag upside down, there's a problem. When you put a rainbow upside down, there's a sort of sense of I don't think I'm being protected, or I don't think that's in play. But it's a very small painting, relatively speaking, for this group, but just a really poignant display. The windows are closed. The door, you can't even be sure whether you can get in or out of that door. And the star, of course, is around the door.
It's forced in, yeah.
But it's the other thing that's interesting, and we'll see it in more of Sam's paintings, is I always enjoy the difference between clouds and smoke. And here you got both sort of. This is not smoke because there's no smokestacks, but it's not exactly clouds. And as Sam said, they're turning to stone is why. But if you look in the background, there are clouds. And as we see more paintings, keep an eye on smoke versus clouds, because sometimes they evolve into it and sometimes they're very distinct from it. But you paint a distinction that just makes you think a little bit more. Say, well, is that cloud or is that smoke? And why would I ask that question? And it's there in a number of the paintings.
I think having that part of the lexicon of Samuel Bak is critical to continuing to investigate and explore each image. Certainly the broken covenant is an ever recurring subject in the images, but also in terms of our hopes and desires for humankind. Somehow we think that the rainbow is symbolizing that there will be no more disasters. And we, as a conglomerate of human beings, seem to figure out new ways to create disasters for one another. Next piece, please. What I wanted to do was share this image of the work called The Ghetto, which is now hanging in the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, and has been up for about 5, maybe 6 months, and will be up for a little bit longer. And to look at this, because this goes back to 1976, and to ask Sam to talk just a bit about the piece. It is given in memory of his grandparents and father, who were destroyed in Vilna between 1940 and 41 and 44. So here we have another ghetto and another star. Sam?
Well, yes, as I painted this painting, I really painted it for myself. I painted it for me to take the place of the tombstone of my grandparents. My two couples of grandparents, because of the war and so on, were living in the same apartment. And I, as a child, enjoyed it enormously because I thought, what a fantastic thing is that thing that they call war. What a fantastic thing. They brought my grandparents together. So when I'm coming to them, there is a competition who will show me their love more. And it was fantastic how I could, remember this enormous sense of love that I had, and slightly, maybe a little also my manipulation of that. And then I was 7 years of age, yes, when my two grandparents, my grandfathers who were queuing up to buy some bread, were taken by the Germans, brought to the camp where they machined down people. And a few months later, my two grandmothers, on the day of Yom Kippur, were taken from the small ghetto. In Vilna, there were two ghettos. There was a big ghetto, a small ghetto, and also sent to Ponari and executed. So when I painted this painting, I very much painted it with the idea of making for myself something for my grandparents. And I imagined this big cube of indifference in which there is this kind of hole. In this hole, there is a whole city. I based it on a larger painting, which hangs today in the gallery, in your gallery, Bernie, which is this big expression of this whole. But this is also related to me, for me, very much the memory of my grandfather, because one day when my grandfather took me to the big synagogue of Vilna, the big synagogue was built after the Jewish people of the ancient ghetto excavated 2 floors into the ground, because it was forbidden that any Jewish building would be taller than the smallest church of the town. So the big synagogue of Vilna, which was a huge space, you reached it by going down many stairs. So we were somehow in the ground and looking at this very high ceiling, maybe 3 floor or 4 floors high, with these enormous stone columns and so on. So these are the things, the personal things that I have put into that painting.
You talked about going down 2 flights of stairs. In 1997, Martin Gilbert, the historian, had taken a few of us on a trip called Roots. And we were in Warsaw, and he pointed out an apartment building that was literally maybe 12 stairs up. And it was rather unusual. He said, what do you see that's strange about this? And most of us kind of looked incredulously. And he said, well, the fact is that the rubble of the ghetto was never taken away. So they just simply built this particular apartment building on top of the rubble. So the notion of looking up or looking down, of at the same time carrying with it memories of what was, whether it was the Vilna Grand Synagogue where you walk down, or looking up at this apartment building in Warsaw, they all reference the same issues, which is basically man's inhumanity to man. And this painting, and then the one that's now in the gallery, are really wonderful colleagues in that sense. And this exhibition, in a sense, if one could visualize it, has come out of that 6-pointed star in the center of this ghetto that you've created. And it's a very, very impressive to see so many people at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston walk up to the painting, read the dedication adjacent to it, and I think be drawn into a discussion about the world in which we are presently living, and which we will continue to live, sadly, unless we make some differences in our behavior. So we're going to look at another painting and then come back to this if we can, Caroline. Rusty, I'd like for you to, if you don't mind, to respond to this work, and then Sam and I will either interrupt you or chime in.
Fine. This is a fabulous piece. It has so many things that I really like about it. One, the star is obvious, and there's yellow roofs, if you will, roofs of some sort. But one of those forms an arrow, which points right out at us, the viewer. And yet this is a sort of foreshortened perspective. I always, and you'll see this on a number of the other paintings, it's the Montaigne sort of concept of something up close is enlarged, and then things. And so the essence of this painting seems to take you into the distance, to the future, to whatever else is going to happen. And yet there's something about pointing the finger at us saying, look carefully, you're involved in this. I gave you a largesse at the very front to bring you in, and you need to pay attention. And again, what we're going to see in so much of this alone is stone walls. And as Sam's described it, this is the indifference around what may be internally. Unfortunately, we're also going to look into the ghetto with a little bit closer look. And unfortunately, although it's circumscribed by hard walls and things, it's inside is not so great either. But we'll see that in a little bit. A couple other things. There's a little cross over here on the right-hand side of the painting. Again, part of Sam's way of I think, of sort of reminding us that there's a religious aspect to things that may or may not work, but you should be thinking about what religion may say about this sense of total isolation. And again, the landscape here is one. We're going to look at multiple other landscapes that Sam has done, but if you see this painting in person, and I would encourage everyone that can to do that, because the process of seeing a whole group of Sam's paintings in a single gallery is overwhelming. I mean, it's wonderful to have one painting on the wall. It's something else. There's a whole different vibe to coming in and experiencing it. And this is one of the larger paintings that, having a large painting, as Sam was talking about size, does allow you to stand back and then walk forward. And it is a different perspective than the small house we just looked at, because it is quite large, and it gives you a different sense of what's happening inside of that structure.
The important point for me is to look inside as well, that it is as if it is a six-pointed box. And with part of that box taken away, then you are invited into a space generally of facades of houses, windows boarded up, bloodstains on the walls. The large painting that we have called The Ghetto from Landscapes of Jewish Experience is precisely that. It is just looking into that. And it comes with the added question whether or not that space is being covered up or is it being excavated? How do we respond to what we as human beings have been part of forever? The next image is going back to, well, we got it right. Thank you, Carolyn, perfect. Just as an opportunity to look once more at this piece. Sam, reflections on the piece that we just took off the screen or its relationship to this image?
Well, my reflection is a feeling of gratitude, you know, that I'm speaking with images and then I hear you reacting to it and finding just the right words to say what I'm trying to suggest with my images. It's fantastic. It's for me as an artist, a wonderful feeling of gratitude.
Very wonderful. I would just point out that Sam's memoir is entitled Painted in Words, and the joy of making that distinction, him as a creative artist who paints, but also writes with such a sense of detail, integrity, and awareness is a rather remarkable thing. The book was written in '97, I think, so that's good 25 years ago. And it reads the same now as it did then, with a great deal of insight into the world which he grew up in. And somehow Amos Oz's introduction points out this, that for him, this was really one of the most engaging of the memoirs because of the way you had been able to create it. So it is a blessing for you to have access to both a paintbrush and a typewriter, or now a computer. Let's move on. Thank you.
This is great too.
Yeah, well, then you get a chance to speak first.
Well, again, we're going to see so many of these. They're just all wonderful images, wonderful in the sense that they are painted beautifully and draw you in. The subject matter is always difficult in ways. Once again, this is the image of the star with some kind of housing in the middle of it. This time it's sort of erupted a little bit over the surface. It's not down deep as other images have been, but again, the doors, the windows, the walls, they're all closed. There's no access to this area of sort of some turbulence. Some of the buildings are knocked over, and there's a little house at the top. So there's again a personal element to it. But the thing that I said, this is for me only, but Sam, the top of the star to me looks like a pyramid, and a pyramid is where people are buried. And it was, I don't know, just for me, it was a wonderful sort of sense of, you know, people who thought they were gods were buried in pyramids, and here's a pyramid at the top of the star, and it sort of brought a lot of that into interpretation. But again, this is a painting that is smaller and completely filled with the structure itself, and it is by itself. It's isolated, it's alone, and what's inside it is alone and empty, but beautifully done.
Sam?
Thank you. I can add that when I decided to paint these large paintings, I had somehow to get into the subject. So I started by doing some small sketches on small canvases. And sketches have sometimes a certain freshness that large works, when you do whatever you have to do, they do not always keep that. They have other aspects. But in these small canvases, which I did really for myself, just to explore whatever I was going to do, there was a certain freshness. Then when you, Bernie, have said that all this is actually an exhibition to be made, I thought, well, then I have to work on each one, because every image is an image. Every image will maybe one day be projected on a computer. Maybe one day it will look much bigger than it physically is. So I returned to work, and it was a very interesting work. It was a very demanding work. How to keep the details right, how to define the things properly, and yet not lose completely the freshness and the energy which the very first, I would say, projection of a certain imagination created on the canvas. So I must say that I personally am very happy with these small paintings, which are almost, in the beginning, they were an intimate diary. And then, like Anne Frank, I decided, oh, maybe then one day it will be published. So I will write it very carefully. And, and then it was published. It is being published.
But it's a superb publication, and I would just encourage people to, as they look at these pieces, to also think about, in quotes, what is the process, namely to start with a single theme or a couple of themes in this case, and then to see them become a theme in variations. Often people mishear your name and hear it as Bach, and certainly theme and variation was a great part of his writing. Here, this opportunity to take essentially the same six-pointed star and have it in such variety, and therefore enhance, I think, our understanding of the sense of isolation and aloneness that you give to each one of the paintings. The next image, as an example of that, refers to the piece in a way that we first started with, and yet very different light, very different space, very different emotion that is generated by this image, which is on one level the same. So Sam, your thoughts particularly about this one?
Well, this specific painting, when I started to do the image of the ghetto in the form of the Star of David, completely surrounded by water, and I was thinking of my memories of the ghetto, and I remember how I have met there in the ghetto some people who, through the underground canalization of the town, were able to get out of the ghetto and then to come back to the ghetto and so on. I thought, well, maybe the alone is not completely alone, but it is somehow connected to some ground. And I tried to see how that image would look when it is somehow connected to the ground. Because I must say that however we are alone, we are never completely alone, because we have this thing that is called memory. We have a memory, we have feelings, we have affections, we have connections that bring us to to the world which is outside of us. So suddenly I realized that this sense alone is much too complex in order to just formulate it in one kind of image.
So before we, I think this may be one of the only water scenes, Sam. You have several of them where the isolation involves a surrounding by water and isolation in water. But it just reminds me, I believe the word ghetto was started in Venice, and Venice is starting to look a little like these paintings. So it was it's an isolation that seems to be coming true.
Yeah.
That Frederick mentioned that, I think, Frederick Osman, when we had the discussion last Sunday.
Oh.
But it's also very interesting to see that what you indicated, which is that it is, in a sense, almost joined to the land in this particular image. And that's an almost, which rarely shows up in the sense of total isolation. The other notion that we do carry within us, the memories of being connected to others, that enables us somehow to get through the sense of being alone and isolated. Brother Thomas wrote, memory is more permanent than matter. And I think particularly given these images of isolation and aloneness, the notion that memory also functions in a very important way to sustain us. Let's look at the next piece, please.
Another beautiful.
And Sam, I'd love for you to talk about this, the totally different feeling, space, impact of the star itself into the landscape.
Well, again, there is a certain personal aspect, because when I kind of projected myself into my past and these years of the war and so on came to the surface, I suddenly remembered the summers of Vilna, how green everything was around the town, and I remember that my parents were worried about coming bombings of the town, and then my aunt Yeta and my uncle Yasha lived outside in the lovely areas of some dachas. The place was called the Wood of Ponari. And so they sent me to live with them, and I was enjoying so much the greenery and so on, and then I heard some excavations. I heard some sounds of construction, and all this was happening in a Russian big army camp, where they were preparing excavations for deposits of fuel and ammunition. And this unfortunately became the excavations where the Jews, my father, my grandparents, were machine gunned and buried. So this kind of total a paradox of a sunny, a light landscape with a lot of green, and then the creation of this structure that is going to suffocate us or to kill us and so on. All this, I think, are in the background of what comes to me. I must just add that what I am saying about these paintings is something that comes after. It's like, you know, the journalist writing about a meal in a restaurant that he had the evening before. And but while I am painting, while I am eating, or when I am enjoying the mere physical fact of painting, it is the painting that tells me what to do. It's not I that tell the painting what to do. I have this wonderful partner, which is called subconscious, and I think this directs my hand. And then later on, when I'm being asked about it, I have to go back and think and then analyze it. And I'm always torn apart between speaking and between trying to go back to the innocence of the creation of it, which is not always conscious.
But I think that's the critical importance of what you have created for the University of Nebraska, which is your post-painting commentary on each of the 512 pieces, that this becomes an enormous resource. And of late in the gallery, we've been producing this small Bak a day as an effort to keep the doctor away. It isn't basically an attempt to allow people to engage with a single image, with someone's perspective about it, to invite them into a conversation with you and the art itself. And it's turned out to be quite wonderful for many people to find their way into your work in a way that was never accessible to them before. So these conversations, I think, do have meaning and importance. Rusty, do you want to comment on this or on to the next one?
I think just I really like this painting because it was such a beautiful painting with the greenery. But I just reiterate what Sam has said, that there are probably 6 or 7 paintings, all with different landscapes. Was up on the mountains, in the middle of the ocean, on a green hill, all the same structure, all the same aloneness, but in very different settings. And clearly, as Sam has said, these are paintings that were in him. These are things that he just started painting. And I think it does represent the sort of universality of placement. I mean, it doesn't matter where this happens. It's the event itself. It's the fact that there is a ghetto, that there's a structure like this, and it can be in the most beautiful of settings like this one, or it can be on a rugged mountain. Looks like it's in Tibet, one of his paintings, very precariously looking, but quite varied, with the same idea inherent in all of them.
And I would say the same questions. Now we can move on, Carolyn. Thank you. So this is related to the painting that we have here in the gallery called The Ghetto, but still very, very different. It reminds me of, there was an exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts where what we were essentially doing was invited to look at the same scene from a different vantage point. And here we're invited to look into this scene of the ghetto as if it is either about to be covered up again or it is in the midst of being excavated. And Sam, if you would talk just briefly about it, I would appreciate it.
You know, it's very funny because we are speaking on Zoom, and actually this painting zooms into the painting which is in the Museum of Fine Arts, into discovering all the rubble of the ghetto. And the houses are maybe, for me, individuals. I mean, I can see every individual person almost as a house that contains in itself a facade. This is how I want to appear, and windows, which maybe are the eyes. And this is why very often my houses are very simple. There are 2 windows and the door, the mouth. And so these houses are destroyed. And then there is on the one of the walls, you can see also a facade that has maybe 2 arches of a synagogue that kind of seem to be peeling off. I mean, and then to the very right, you have a triangle and another triangle that they create the Star of David. They create the Mogen David, the yellow star that we were wearing on us, which was our identity. But it also has, to the very right, the 2 planks of wood that stand for the Jewish letter Vav, the V, the Vilna, and there is also buried the letter Gimel, which stands for ghetto, under these stars. So, I mean, all these things come to me somehow, I would say, automatically, without, as I said before, while I'm painting them, I don't think of them, and then I discover them, and then it is always for me a wonderful experience to come into my studio in the morning and see what I have done yesterday, or sometimes what I have done a month ago, because very often I paint on many, many paintings. So some of them, I bring them to a certain stage, I put them with the painted side against the wall so I don't see them and I forget them. And then when I take them out, I suddenly discover them with fresh eyes. I see the problems, I see what I have to improve or to somehow balance better. But I also discover in them many things that I kind of wrote to myself in a very intimate letter. And the letter is being opened so much later. So it has to do with the process of painting. It has to do with whatever is buried in me and tries to come out. Well, I hope that's what I can say about it.
I would only mention, in addition, Sam, what a beautiful perspective this is. I keep going back to perspective, but you're such a master of that. I mean, here we are just on the edge of this, and you're sort of, oh, I may fall in even, and you're sort of really drawn in. And I know that's part of what you do, is to bring people to your work so they do engage. But this is just fabulous to be standing on the edge. And this is one of the bigger paintings. And it's again a double perspective. You stand back and you see this, and you're sort of, well, let me go over and look more carefully at that. And then suddenly you're on the edge of this cliff almost that you could fall into, and then you realize all that's in there. So just beautifully painted that way.
Thank
There
you.
is the notion of the choice of creating a pile of bodies in this space and making it much more confrontational, or allowing the viewer to begin to think about these facades of houses as if they represent the people who are living in those houses. And that distance, if you will, and it's not a very big distance, nonetheless is critical for people being allowed to experience and then ask questions as you ask questions with all of these pieces. And in what way can we engage with the acts themselves, the continuation of those acts in terms of how it is shared generation to generation. And then are there things that we somehow can do to help prevent human beings from destroying one another at an extraordinary and painful rate? So the paintings still, Sam, in spite of all of our words, remain eternal questions for me. Let's look at the next image, Caroline, if you will.
We should, in terms of time, Bertie, maybe we should skip this one because it's very similar in a lot of ways, and we've got 3 more wonderful paintings to do.
Oh, well, you're good, but we always run over, so don't worry about it.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. This particular one has such an extraordinary sense of disarray in it that I really wanted Sam to have a chance just to undisarray us.
I think
Well,
Sam,
it's very difficult for me to disarray it because it is certainly a mess.
Right, I love it. Yeah.
And I must say that it is very strange, because there is in me the painter who sees everything only in terms of forms and the way the forms are structured. And I think that these paintings have a lot of, they have in them, of the images that I can see when I read the newspapers today of Ukraine, of the bombings, of the destruction, and sometimes the photographs done, of course, by many photographers and then chosen by art specialists, art editors. They are sometimes of a great beauty. And then I look at them, and there is drama. There is a tragedy of human destruction. There's a tragedy of loss of human life, and at the same time there is beauty in them. So all that mess is something that I experience when I look at what is happening in the world in which I live. And the world in which I live is the world that I'm trying to project, even if I tied to a specific moment in my life, because I'm convinced, and this is not something very new or very unusual that I'm saying, that the universal is always anchored in something very specific. In something very specific. I mean, Bashevis Singer was able to write about the Jewish shtetl, or about a certain part of New York where a Jewish population lived, with the specificity of that time in history and human culture and so on. And yet, when people read it, there is a certain universal aura that all these things have. And this is true for all great literature, for all great art. I mean, the Dutch were painting portraits of people with incredibly uncomfortable colors, and yet we look at them and it doesn't disturb us. We look at the faces, we look at the expression in their eyes, we look at the soul that is somehow projected to us. So what can I say?
No, I thank you, Sam, so much, because that's something that we go over many, many times with many of the artists whose works we show, which is if they work out of themselves, then they have the potential of speaking broadly to a more universal population. If their goal is to begin dealing with the universal first, and then hoping that it communicates to the individual, it generally fails as art and as communication. So I think re-emphasizing that with this piece, and we now can go on to the next one as well, is so critical to understand. This, at least in my view, is one of the strongest pieces that, based on those, you can see the dates on it from 76 to 2016 to 2022. One of the advantages of having an exhibit is that there's a deadline and something needs to be finished by that date. And this was finished for this exhibition, and is an absolutely extraordinary panorama, if you will, of aloneness. So, Sam?
Well, strangely enough, the painting that you have seen before that is hanging in the museum, is the same size of canvas and so on. I started to paint it in New York, and I didn't finish it. I wasn't happy with it, and I sent it from New York to, I believe, France, where I had a studio. Then later it ended up in Switzerland, and I never found the time to work on it. And then it came to the States with me when I moved to the States in '93. Then almost 20 years later, or more than 20 years later, I started to work on it. And I worked on it, and I worked on it, and I had this big canvas, but I wasn't happy with it. And then when you, Bernie, came to my studio and you saw my work and so on, I don't think you saw this painting, or maybe it was not in exactly this stage in which it is. I thought, well, I'll take it up and I'll work on it. And I've brought it to the point in which I said, okay, I must finish with it. It's impossible to finish a painting because you always find that there is something else. Right now, I look at this painting and I think, well, I could have done this like that. I could have done it. Doesn't mean it would have been better, but there is always a desire to change something. So, but you have to finish with it. You have at a certain point to say, okay, so let's accept the general wisdom that the enemy of the very good is trying to do a little better. And and I'm quite happy with this painting, seeing it on the computer. So it's all right. And the Ner Tamid here is something that was a later addition to the painting, the eternal flame. That is something, again, I was thinking, you know, I'm not an observant Jew. I don't go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, but Yom Kippur I remember always as the day in which I lost my grandparents, my grandmothers, and then it became also the date for me of remembering my grandfathers. So this candle that burns here and brings this kind of upright smoke is for me a personal element of commemoration. I think I cannot say much more than that.
No, I think it's quite wonderful, Rusty, and I'm going to say something about it as well.
Yeah, I think this is a fabulous piece. This is one of the very large pieces again, and has so much in it. The ladders that don't let you out. There's the candle, which is supposed to be next to the Torah scroll. You don't see a Torah scroll, and is the candle going to get covered up, or is it enlightening us? Is it something there that is going to be good? Is that smoke, or is that people smoke in a way? There's so much in this painting. If you get a chance to, if you just see this painting up close, just the material in the foreground that just looks like the top of a rock or something has incredible patina coloring, and you match that against some of the orange, and it's just in terms of a technical coloring, amazing. There is the apparent, maybe it's one of the tablets that is being held up in front of the light. Compositionally, there's so much of what Sam uses to remind us of thoughtful interaction between ourselves, and then what is, if anything, the place for religious intervention in any of it. But it is really a phenomenal painting, and the candle is again, there are no people, you haven't seen people in any of these paintings, and yet there's a personal humanity absent people that resonates, and that's where the loss is, that you don't have people, they're gone, or you don't feel them. The candle is sort of that funny sort of Sam Bak hope signal, maybe, in a little bit. There's always a little something that says maybe, maybe, and that's what a candle is for me in this painting. It's the maybe in Sam's painting.
Or perhaps.
Perhaps.
In Hebrew, in more the notion of ulai in Hebrew, perhaps it could happen differently. Perhaps it could be that. I also love the fact that the smoke itself, as it's moving up, creates movement itself in what otherwise is an image of stability and almost static presence, or silence, if you will. And then the very beautiful landscape in the very background. So on to the next couple of pieces, please. First, this one.
Well, this painting for me was a kind of, how to get away from it.
Right.
And I thought of the Jews that boarded the boat that was going to take them from Hamburg to the United States, but from Hamburg brought them to Cuba, brought them back to the Germany, from which they tried to escape, and they ended up in concentration camps. Sure. So this is small painting. Maybe one day I will do a large one on this very same subject. There is, of course, an overpowering Star of David on the whole composition, made of those planks and of this kind of pyramid that is floating there, related to some man-made pieces of clouds and so on, and there is a question mark. Where should I go? How could I go away? What will happen to us, and so on? And the promise was made to these people that they will be saved, but of course the promise was not fulfilled. So this is what I could say about a very, very loaded subject on a very small surface. So seeing it now on my computer, it gives me an enormous desire to go and pick up my brushes and take a large canvas and do the whole thing over again.
Rusty, do you want to say something briefly?
Yeah, briefly. Sam's boats are never in the water. They're not going anywhere, unfortunately, and they're made of stone anyway, usually. But again, just reiterating, they're all the notions of chance. Are the dice in the front, they're dominoes sort of on the side of the ship. I love the planking. You almost feel like this is Noah's Ark in some way too, that you'd be walking up the planks and going, but this one's not going anywhere. So there really is no rescue for this. Just a wonderful, again, small painting, but a wonderful exhibit of multiple icons of uncertainty that this certainly represents.
The uncertainty still plays into the last image we're looking at today, which is certainty, namely the burial shroud that Jews are wrapped in when they are buried in a very simple manner. Certainly in Israel, even today in the Orthodox community, there's no embalming. You're simply put into a shroud. And here to feel the shape of the six-pointed star enshrouded, if you will, or covered up. And the background, and also in both foregrounds, you have houses with two eyes looking out or observing the scene of the end, if you will, of one's life. And to think about it again in the context of where we began, which was around the notion of alone. Not only do you get your diagnosis that Rusty had referred to earlier alone and have to live with it and deal with it, but you also ultimately die alone, even if people are there with you who love you and care for you. So this idea that there are a few observers, if you will, with their eyes on the scene itself, certainly reminds us that we are both here alone and somehow connected. Sam?
There is very little that I can add to it. First of all, my gratitude for all your wonderful observations. In this painting, again, there is the yellow of the yellow Star of David, but it's a shroud, but it's also the way of trying to forget about it. Forget about it for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes forget about it because we have the need to forget things that help us to live. Forgetting is usually considered a kind of a negative element. At my age, close to 90, forgetting is I forget names, I forget all kinds of things, so it's a very bad thing. But on the whole, I think how wonderful it is that I also can forget all the unpleasant things that have happened to me, or forget all the things that upset me, and so on. So I can be happy because I'm able to forget. So the Holocaust is a very, very painful subject. And forgetting it, people were accused, the whole generation of survivors of the Holocaust were kind of accused of having created a generation, a first generation of survivors, a second generation of survivors that were completely neurotic because their parents were trying to forget and were not telling them, and so on and so forth. And all these are the complexities of life, and that there are sometimes no good choices available. And so I don't know, all these things have been somehow nourishing me. And maybe what I said in this painting is not what I meant, or maybe what I meant is something that I discover that in some eyes may be right, in some eyes may be wrong. And this between yes and no, it's a wonderful thing to finish what I have to say.
I love it. Rusty?
I would just say very briefly that this is the most human of the paintings for me. The concept of shrouds, the way the cloth folds, it's not stone, it's not, boards. It is something almost soft relative to the other things. So I felt very touched almost at a human level, but the idea was a human level of loss, that there was death associated with this. And I would say in terms of forgetting, it's like if you, Sam, or anyone else who survived this is wrapping things up and covering them so that life can go on, it's one interpretation. If all the people around you are trying to cover you up, that's a whole different interpretation. So one could look at this as,
Right.
am I doing it myself, or is it being imposed on me? But it has the most, again, human character of all the paintings, I think, and that ending on it is great.
So I would just end with a couple of notes. One is to once again emphasize, which we have done in earlier webinars, the critical importance artistically of being able to render the textures as it is in that particular painting. so successfully. And two, I love the notion of the cover up, if you will, that Sam is talking about in terms of both remembering and forgetting. All these questions, all these possibilities are represented in these paintings. And the invitation remains for each and every one of us to approach the icons of alone, both alone and together with others, to continue the conversation. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Look forward to having you visit the show. And if not, the catalog, the images are always available online. Thank you, Carolyn. The people who submitted lovely poem and short story, Carolyn will be in touch with both of you, and you both will get the prize that we had indicated, a signed copy of the book. So it worked out. It was wonderful to have those responses and to say thank you to one and all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Rusty,
Thank you, fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank
take
you.
care. Bye-bye.